there is a line in your financial life you will almost certainly cross without noticing. Nothing happens on the day you cross it. No alert, no letter, no round number on your statement. You go to work the same way. You spend the same way. And underneath all of it, the math quietly changes direction. After that line, your portfolio stops depending on you. It grows more each year than your entire life costs to run. And it does that whether or not you add another dollar. Most people find out years later, if they find out at all. I want to pin down where that line sits, because the version you see online puts it in the wrong place. The gap between the wrong place and the right one is about $600,000. Start with what unstoppable actually means, because it is not a balance. People assume there is a magic number. 500,000, a million, whatever, there is not. Two people can hold identical portfolios and only one is past this line. The line is a relationship between two numbers, not a number by itself. Those numbers are what your portfolio grows in a year, and what your life costs in a year. When the first is consistently bigger, the portfolio funds your whole existence out of its growth. And it still ends the year larger than it started. That is the whole idea. Nothing else about it is complicated. Now, there are actually two of these crossings, and almost everybody confuses them. Let me use my neighbor Greg to keep this concrete. Greg is in his mid-50s, an engineer in Columbus. He puts about $24,000 a year into retirement accounts. His household runs on about $60,000. The first crossing is when his portfolio grows more in a year than he adds. Use a 7% real return, roughly what American stocks have delivered after inflation over the long run. Greg crosses that line at about $343,000. That one feels great, and it should. It is the moment the market becomes a bigger contributor than you are. But it is not the line this video is about. Greg can cross it and still depend entirely on his paycheck. His portfolio is beating his savings, not his life. The second crossing is different. That is when the portfolio grows more in a year than his entire household spends. For Greg, at $60,000 of annual spending, that line sits at about $857,000. Look at how far apart those two are. The second line sits more than $500,000 past the first one. Most people who feel like they have arrived have only crossed the first one. I'm Tom. This channel is about real personal finance. The kind that actually works for normal people, not the kind that gets you to click a thumbnail. No motivational fluff or fantasy returns, we just discuss what the math actually does over time. If that's what you want, hit subscribe. Now watch what happens after the second crossing, because it is genuinely strange. Say Greg gets to $900,000 and stops contributing entirely. He retires or takes a job he likes that pays nothing and lives on the portfolio. Year 1, it grows $63,000 in real terms. He spends $60,000, so he ends the year with $3,000 more than he started. That is not impressive. $3,000 on $900,000 is a rounding error. This is exactly where most people decide the whole idea is overhyped. Watch what that rounding error does. By year 10, the annual growth is $65,500 and the surplus is $5,500. 10 years after that, growth reaches $70,850 and the surplus has doubled to $10,850. At the 30-year mark, growth is $81,340 and the surplus runs $21,343 a year. After 30 years of funding his entire life out of it, the balance is about $1.18 million. He never added a dollar. He spends $60,000 every single year, and he has more money than when he started. And notice which number is doing the work here. It is not the return. 7% was 7% in year 1, and it is 7% in year 30. What changed is the base it applies to, and the base changed because of the surplus. The surplus is the engine. It exists only because spending stayed put while growth did not. The surplus is not fixed. Every year it feeds a bigger base. That base throws off more growth, which leaves a bigger surplus. The gap widens on its own forever, with nobody managing it. Now compare that to someone standing just short of the line. Take the identical situation, but start at $800,000 instead of $900,000. Same spending, same return, same 30 years. That person ends with about $422,000, and the trajectory points down the whole way. $100,000 of difference at the start, two completely opposite directions 30 years later. That is what it means to say the line is real. Here is the part that explains why nobody notices when they cross it. Your spending does not rise to meet your capacity. It just does not for most people. Somebody who has lived on $5,000 a month for 20 years does not suddenly find $9,000 normal. The account saying they could does not change it. The number that feels normal was set long ago by habit. Habits do not read statements. So the portfolio climbs on one line while your life sits flat on another. The space between them widens every year. Nothing in your day tells you what happened. Your grocery bill does not change. Your car does not change. The only way to see it is to compare the two numbers on purpose. Almost nobody does. That is the version of this story told online, and up to here it is true. Now I have to tell you the part that gets left out, because leaving it out is how people get hurt. Go back to Greg's second crossing at $857,000. He is spending $60,000 out of that. Do the division. That is a 7% withdrawal rate. Now think about what you already know. Every safe withdrawal study ever conducted lands somewhere between 3.5 and 4.5% for a long retirement. 7% is roughly double the number the research supports. So here's the uncomfortable truth about that line. The exact moment your portfolio becomes unstoppable on average is also the moment you are most fragile. That withdrawal rate is one of the riskiest in personal finance. Both things are true at once, and the internet only tells you the first one. Here is what that fragility actually costs, using real market history rather than an average. Take Greg at exactly $857,000, spending $60,000. Run him through the inflation-adjusted returns of the American stock market from 2000 through 2009. 3 losing years to start, a recovery, then 2008. At the end of that decade, he has about $36,000 left. Not $36,000 less, $36,000 total, out of what looked like an unstoppable portfolio 10 years earlier. The average never failed him. The order did. He was withdrawing 7% from a falling balance in the early years. That meant selling a large number of shares at low prices. Those shares were not there to recover when the market came back. Now run the same decade for somebody with 1.5 million spending, that same 60,000. That works out to a 4% withdrawal rate. They come out of the 2000s with about $496,000. Same market, same spending, same decade. One of them is nearly wiped out. The other is bruised but fine. So there is a third crossing, and it is the one that actually matters. The first is when growth beats your contributions. Number 2 arrives when growth beats your spending on average. And the third comes when growth beats your spending with enough margin that a bad decade cannot reverse it. For Greg's $60,000 of spending, the average line is $857,000. Adding margin puts it near $1.2 million, and getting all the way to a 4% rate puts it at $1.5 million. That is the difference between unstoppable in a spreadsheet and unstoppable in a life. And there is a tidy coincidence hiding in that middle number. If you assume a disappointing 5% real return instead of 7%, the line for $60,000 of spending lands at $1.2 million, which is the same place you get by using 7% and adding a margin for bad sequences. 2 different worries, one answer. When the cautious version of 2 separate assumptions points at the same number, that number is usually worth trusting. And notice something about that third line. It is the same arithmetic as the old 4% guideline, arrived at from a completely different direction. The safe withdrawal research asked how much you can take without running out. This question asks how much you need before the thing grows while you live on it. They land in the same neighborhood, which is a good sign that neither is nonsense. Now let me give you the reward for getting past that third line, because it is real and almost nobody talks about it. Bonds stop being a requirement. Think about why a retiree holds bonds in the first place. It is not because bonds are exciting. It is because the portfolio has to keep producing a paycheck through bad years. Bonds cushion the drop, so the retiree is not forced to sell stocks at the bottom. That is a structural need. It exists because the withdrawals have to happen no matter what the market is doing. Once you are past the third crossing, that pressure changes. Your spending is covered by growth with room to spare. The cushion is large enough that a bad stretch does not force your hand. Safety becomes something you choose because you like sleeping well, not something the math requires. And that choice has a price tag. Take $900,000 funding, $60,000 a year spending, at a 5% real return, roughly what a heavy bond allocation delivers. The portfolio drops to about $184,000 over 25 years. At 7%, holding stocks, it grows to about $1.9 million. I am not telling you to dump your bonds. I am telling you that after this line, the question changes from what do I need to what do I prefer. Those are very different conversations, and most people never realize they have been promoted from one to the other. There is one more version of this worth understanding. It applies to a lot of people watching, and it is the least discussed of all. You can cross the second line while you are still working full-time. Greg at 900,000, still employed, still adding his 24,000 a year, reaches about 1.4 million in 5 years. In 10, he is at 2.1 million. In 15, he's over 3 million. But the interesting part is not the balance. It is what his job became on the day he crossed. Before the crossing, his paycheck was funding his retirement. That was its structural job. After the crossing, his retirement funds itself, and the paycheck is doing something else entirely. It is buying a bigger version of the same future. That is a completely different relationship with work, and almost nobody notices the switch. They keep grinding with the same urgency they had at 40 because nothing on the outside told them the job description changed. Some people, once they see it, keep working exactly the same. That is a legitimate answer. Others cut back, take the lower paying job they actually wanted, or stop dreading Mondays quite so much. That is also legitimate. The point is that it becomes a decision instead of an assumption. Now the honest limits, because this topic attracts a lot of nonsense, and I do not want to add to it. First and most important, you do not need to reach any of these crossings to retire. Not the second one, and definitely not the third. Almost every retired person in this country is spending down their portfolio rather than living off pure growth, and that is completely normal. That is what the money was for. A portfolio that slowly shrinks over 30 years while paying for a good life has done its job perfectly. These lines are milestones, not gates. If you treat them as requirements, you will work 5 extra years you did not owe anybody. Second, everything here used 7% after inflation, which is a long-run historical average and not a promise. Your actual decade will look nothing like a smooth line, which is the entire lesson of the 2000s example. Third, I ignored taxes to keep the arithmetic visible. If that 900,000 sits in a traditional retirement account, a meaningful slice of every withdrawal goes to the government. Your real spending capacity is lower than the raw number suggests. And fourth, which is the big one, Social Security changes its math enormously in your favor. Greg's line was 857,000 because his portfolio had to cover the whole 60,000. But say he has 26,000 a year coming in from Social Security. Now the portfolio only has to produce 34,000, and his line drops to about 486,000. For a married couple, it moves further still. 2 average checks come to roughly 45,000 a year. That leaves 15,000 for the portfolio to cover, and the line falls to about $214,000. That is the most useful number in this video. A couple with average Social Security and 60,000 of spending crosses the unstoppable line somewhere around $200,000. My friends Carl and Linda in Pittsburgh are exactly this. He was a plumber, she taught school, their duplex is paid off, their savings are modest by internet standards, and neither of them has ever used the word portfolio in conversation. They are past the line, they have been for years. Nobody ever told them. The only way to know is to subtract your guaranteed income from your spending first, and almost nobody does that step. The reason this matters so much is that most people run the calculation the hard way. They take their entire annual spending and ask what pile of money produces it. That question has a frightening answer, and it drives people to work years longer than they needed to. The right question is smaller. What is left over after the income you already have, and what pile produces that? Before the action step, one observation about why this particular line is so easy to miss. Most financial milestones announce themselves. Paying off a mortgage comes with a final statement. Hitting a round number shows up on your screen. Retiring comes with a party and a cake. This one has no event attached to it. It is not a transaction. Nothing arrives in the mail. It is a change in the relationship between two numbers, and relationships do not send notifications. That is also why it is so easy to be past it and still feel behind. The feeling of being behind was set by an earlier version of your finances, and feelings update far more slowly than balances do. So here is what I would actually do, and it takes about 5 minutes. Write down 2 numbers. The first is what your household truly spends in a year, not what you think it should be. The second is your invested balance multiplied by 5%, which is a slightly conservative stand-in for real growth. Then subtract your expected Social Security from that spending number before you compare them. If the growth number is larger, you are past the second crossing, and you should know that about yourself. If it is close, you're in the zone where a few more years of contributions genuinely change your life. And if it is not close yet, you now know the actual distance, which is far more useful than a vague sense of being behind. There is one more thing worth doing with that distance. Split it into the two things that can close it. The first is raising the growth number, which means adding to the balance. That is the lever everybody thinks about, and it is the slow one. The second is lowering the spending number, and almost nobody runs it. The line is your spending divided by your return. So every $1,000 you permanently cut from annual costs pulls it down by about $14,000. So a household that trims $6,000 a year of permanent cost moves the finish line $86,000 closer. That is usually faster than saving $86,000. Both levers work. Most people only ever pull one of them, because the strangest thing about this whole subject is not the math. It is that this can already be true about you right now, today, while you sit there feeling like nothing has changed. The account does not announce it. Your life does not announce it. It only becomes real when somebody tells you which two numbers to compare, and then you go and compare them. Tell me in the comments which crossing you are closest to, and tell me whether subtracting Social Security moved your line as much as it moved Greg's. I read every comment and I reply to as many as I can, and if you want the next video, hit subscribe. I'll see you in the next one.